As the calendars would turn to mark the beginning of the 20th century, the city of Brandon would experience an influx of new residents seeking enriched opportunities on the fledgling prairies. The city would be bolstered by new money flooding into the community, and entrepreneurs, much like the railway, were looking to stake a claim on Brandon at the time. The railway and commerce opportunities were abundant in the city, and the Canadian Northern was prepared to open up the West through an ever-growing collection of spur lines throughout the prairies. That growth would allow for wealth, and with that wealth came a drive to reach beyond one's social circle. These trappings would be the motivation for entities in the city far more lavish than ever before. Entities like the Prince Edward Hotel. The Canadian Northern Railway had invested heavily in the hotel, an entity comprised of the most lavish rooms at offer on the prairies. Costs would swell close to $500,000 to build the structure, and when complete, it would be the jewel in the arsenal of the railway at the time. Not without its share of controversy, the construction was mired by striking workers, growing civil unrest, and lost furniture in the disaster that was the Titanic. Those delays would eventually turn to joy, though, as on June 1st, 1912, it finally opened its doors to the public. My name is Sean Cameron, and having grown up in this community, I felt it was important to examine the lost heritage that was the Prince Edward Hotel. Former manager of the hotel, Anthony Griffin, explains it became the epitome of elegance in a vastly changing world.
I arrived in Brandon by Canadian Pacific on May the 1st, 1961. And as I said, I couldn't believe that Brandon could be so dry, so hot, and so absent of water, because I'd come from the Okanagan. But it took me 3 years to become used to it and acclimatized, and I'm still here.
Upon Griffin's arrival in the city, he was somewhat overwhelmed with the size and scope of the project he had taken on. Griffin had spent the better part of his career in the hotel management business, and prior to arriving in the Wheat City in 1961, had spent some time at the sister hotels in the chain representing the Prince Edward.
I found that the hotel was, when I first came, was much larger than I had anticipated. And so as a result, I had to get used to the style and the demands of management, because I was expected to live in the hotel. And I worked from anywhere from 6 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock the following morning, depending on how late the parties were going and how active the bar was, and how late it was that the trains came in, because the trains came right into the back of the hotel.
The Eddy represented a different style and a different time in this community. Its legacy, much like the building itself, is lost on the current generation, calling this small prairie city home. It's a different style and a different period to what we're used to now. But it was enjoyable. I loved it. I love the hotel business. But it's demanding, and as I say, you start early and you work late, particularly when you're assistant manager. When you're manager, you can take a little more time off. As we are coming around here, you're walking outside the hotel, I'm walking inside the hotel. Okay, so the sidewalk itself is actually quite a lot broader than it was before? Or?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
So I'm walking along here, it's up to 1980. What am I looking at here? What do we see?
The height of these pillars is approximately the height of the windows on the main floor of the hotel. So when I came to the hotel, they were actually all covered in on the inside, not on the outside, on the inside, because This was part of the bar on the inside.
Okay. So we have the structure, and as you mentioned, it's a narrower sidewalk we're looking at.
That's right.
The building punches fairly close to the road then.
Oh yes, very close.
So,
yeah. Because in those days, in the early days, of course, there were no parking meters, and very few signs.
Right. So now we're walking up to, in the day, what would have been basically the orientation of the grand entrance.
That right. This would be approximately in fact, I think the dimensions here are pretty accurate for the general opening. Now, there were double doors to enter. Then there was a second set, and that would be on this level. There was a second set of double doors which opened onto three large, very wide steps, which was all in marble. If you went straight through here, you would go right through the lobby to the exit at the rear of the hotel to the train station. On the right-hand side, where those trees are, is approximately where the elevators were. Two elevators, a freight elevator and a passenger elevator. On the left-hand side of those steps would have been the registration desk over to about halfway through that bowl.
Okay. Well, let's take a walk through the front doors.
Okay. Yeah. There are two really memorable experiences. The first was the first winter fair that I was at the hotel at, because when I came to the hotel, Prince Edward Hotel was #1 in the community, and had been for many years. And we were always full. We had all the parties and the receptions and the accommodation of all the VIPs, and it was a very active, very full, very fun time for everybody. We were constantly on the go, and those were days when you got to work at 6 o'clock in the morning for the Western breakfast, and you then you went to bed at 2 o'clock the following morning when the President's party broke up. That was the first one was the most memorable. And the second experience, I think, that was most memorable was the visit of our Lieutenant Governor, or our Governor General. And when Saint Laurent came through, he had a huge entourage. We were the center for his accommodation, for the official dinner, and all the trappings and the VIP experience that goes along with the visit of a Governor General.
Elizabeth Grant would arrive at Brandon University from the East Coast and would come here as a student, but during her time in her studies here, she would work at the Prince Edward Hotel in the cafe as a waitress. Elizabeth has some amazing stories to share with us about her time there, and a not so great exit from her time at the Prince Edward Hotel.
Oh, I came to Brandon. I followed my piano teacher, actually, from Halifax. I graduated from high school. I was ready to go away to university to do music. I was accepted in London, Toronto, and Vancouver, and then my piano teacher, Gordon McPherson, left the CBC in Halifax, and he and Francis Chaplin and Ed Bichet came to Brandon as the Brandon University Trio on a Canada Council grant. And Gordon came out and had a look at the school and said, "Why don't you think about coming to Brandon, because it looks like a pretty good school?" And I thought, well, At least I know I'm going to have a fabulous piano teacher. So I came to Brandon from Halifax, and what a shock that was. Anyway, 6 weeks later, I met my husband, and 48 years later, I'm still here. I applied at the coffee shop to be a waitress, and I got a job, and my husband worked in the bar, my boyfriend then, and we went from there. There were lots of amusing things. We were very much a family, and I met some great people and made some wonderful connections. One of the other waitresses in the coffee shop, for instance, had a tiny little bungalow with a one-bedroom basement, and one summer, 5 of us music students that were in town working lived in that one-bedroom apartment in her basement, for instance. Everybody cared about everybody else, and we worked together. The camaraderie was wonderful. I remember this was pre-Trudeau days, and the drinking age was 21. So when I would have to deliver food into the bar, I wasn't old enough to go, and there was a security guard who always said, "Let me check your teeth," like I was a horse. And he'd say, "Well, I guess you can go in far enough to deliver the food."
Youth Maker came through when I was there, yeah. But he was very very quiet. His entourage was very quiet. He saved all his marketing or promotion of the Conservative Party for the tremendous political events that took place at the Wheat City Arena.
We had lots of characters. Well, you had one of 2 shifts in the coffee shop. You were either 7:30 to 3:30 or 3:30 till close. And we had lots of characters that came in day by day. There's one man I will never forget. He was old. Well, I was 19, so anybody over 21, you know, is old when you're 19. And he was blind, and he lived somewhere along 9th Street there, and he would come in the morning for coffee, and he'd come in the afternoon for tea. And he couldn't see, and so he would come up to the cash register afterwards, put his hand in his pocket, and take out change, and just hold it out and expect you to take the right amount of money. Well, we'd take a nickel or a dime or something. We called him Gramps, and we all just loved him. We tripped over each other to wait on him.
There was another permanent resident, and that was Roxy Cosgrove. And she was very active in all the clubs, in the art club, in the Conservative club, in the the Brandon Women's Club, all the clubs that used to meet at the Prince Edward Hotel, and they all did, the men's service clubs and the women's clubs. Roxy Cosgrove was part and parcel of them. And she was the individual, was probably the most famous individual of resident guests we had, because she had an opinion on everything and didn't hesitate to express it. She was a little woman, but a vibrant woman. The other one who was really interesting was Professor Lightbody. Dr. Lightbody he was from another generation. He was from another lifestyle. He had a room on the first floor, and it was at the front of the building. He didn't like showers, so he had a room with a bath. And I guess the thing that we all, anybody who was with the Prince Edward when he was there, remember is that he used to read incessantly. He was an average reader. And one day we noticed there was water coming through the main dining room ceiling, and we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Our housekeeper detected that it must have been from this room at the front of the hotel, which was Dr. Lightbody's. Anyway, she knocked, went in and tried to get into the hotel, into the room. There was no answer, but she could hear water running. So anyway, she knocked again, and finally she used her pass key to go in. And here, Dr. Lightbody was reclined in his bathtub with his book in front of him and the water running and flooding all over the place. And it didn't seem to bother him. He was just that type of guy.
There's so many Dr. Lightbody stories, like the time he took his car to the university, stopped it at, I think, Princess and 10th to help somebody across the street. Forgot he had his car in the middle of the intersection, walked the rest of the way to the university, and left his car sitting there all day. Other times that he would take his car to the university, forget it was there, and walk back to the Prince Eddy, and then the next morning would be most disturbed that he couldn't find his car in the parking lot.
I started at the Prince Edward Hotel in about 1956. I was a switchboard operator then, and I stayed there. Well, I was a switchboard operator there until when I went to work there, they were just putting the coffee shop in. It had been the pub before, and they moved the pub downstairs, and they were putting the coffee shop in, and they were also building the first bar, or the first cocktail lounge rather than bar in Brandon. When the restaurant opened, they asked if I would be a hostess in there, and I thought, well, it could work, I'll go. I didn't particularly like it in there, so I went back to the desk, and then I became a desk clerk. And then I was the chief desk clerk for some years after that, and we didn't always have an operator, a telephone operator after that. Sometimes there was just one of us there. But I guess I was there for the biggest part of 15 years. In those days, we probably had 10 bellhops at any given time. I mean, working, not on a shift, but there would be, and they were all schoolboys, 15 or 16 years old, and some of them are still in Brandon. Harvey Carroll is not in Brandon, but he had business here for many years after. I didn't think at the time that they would amount to anything, but they're all great guys. The building was kind of unbelievable, you know, to well, I guess to a young person, but to anybody. Everybody that came in the building couldn't believe the grandeur of it. You know, everything was oak or marble, and in those days that wasn't a big deal, I guess, but in the days after, it certainly was, because you know, it was hard to believe that you could come to Brandon, I think, little Brandon, and see something that beautiful. In those days, we didn't have the Centennial Auditorium, of course, but acts would come to the old arena. And we had Tex Ritter, we had the Irish Rovers, and the Irish Rovers at that time were all about 19 years old, and Don Messer, Johnny Cash, you know, all those people, and stayed at the hotel. You felt like you knew them, and you know, you could talk to them and recognize them as soon as they come through the door. And of course that was a big thing to them, to be recognized and to say your room is ready, and you know, so I guess that sort of thing would stick out in my mind. And the fact now that hotels and that have gone the other way. I mean, you come into the hotel, you look after yourself, you look after your luggage. Nobody looks after you in very few hotels now. And I mean, that was a big thing then. Everything was a lot more formal then and in the hotel than it is today, or you wouldn't believe the difference in the way people, you know, act today, and the way you had to act in the hotel to be part of the system. People dressed beautifully, you know. You didn't come in with jeans on, you didn't come in with just a pair of nice pants on, you come in formal. And the women all had long dresses, and it was quite beautiful. And it's the same when I think back. But one of the memories that I would have too is Kay Rowe, who worked for the Sun, would sweep in there like, you know, like nothing we'd ever seen before. She'd probably just come from New York or something, and it was, you know, it was fascinating to see. It's hard to put yesterday with today kind of thing in those senses. I think we've got lots of culture here. I think the auditorium has brought lots of outside culture. You know, we have museums that are probably much better than they were in those days because those days were just happening then. It was so the middle of town, you know. The Prince Eddy to Brandon then was like the Keystone is to Brandon now, I think. I would have to say that. Today has changed so much from then that I can't see it today as a hotel. I could maybe see it if someone had bought it and made a senior's home out of it or something, but I can't see it as it was then, today.
Brandon Sun has been the documenter record in the city of Brandon for over a century, and their online editor, Grant Hamilton, would undertake a project in 2012 to look at the history of the Prince Edward Hotel on its 80th anniversary of existence in the city.
Well, I just realized that the anniversary of the Prince Eddy's opening was coming up, and I sort of happened across that information, and I thought, wow, this is a good opportunity. We have some archives. I've been looking at for a reason to get into our archives and publish more of those really historical things that the Brandon Sun's been around for so long to do. And this seemed like a great opportunity to do that. But as soon as I started digging, I found more and more and more. I kind of fell down the rabbit hole a little bit, but what a rewarding rabbit hole. I think I did 3 or 4 months of solid off and on research before the first story published, and I was working pretty hard through that time. Credit to my girlfriend, who had a lot of patience through that, as I'm sure you're aware. But I had a lot of late nights and a lot of really fun afternoons and a lot of access through archives and museums and digging into the Brandon Sun's archives as well to see what people were talking about at the time about the Prince Edward Hotel, and to see the stories through other people's eyes, like historical eyes. I found that really rewarding. Of course, you go back 100 years and people wrote differently, they spoke differently, they dressed differently, they thought about the city in a different way, and that, I think that evolution was really, really clear. Right at the start, it was a very optimistic time. We're looking at a boom time in Brandon's history. They thought Brandon deserved the best, and the best included this hotel. It was a railway hotel, it was a showcase for the railway, it was a showcase for the throngs of people that were going to come and visit Brandon. I mean, I'm too young to have any first-hand memory of the Prince Edward Hotel myself. I'm too young to have experienced a boomtown Brandon until recently with, say, Maple Leaf. But that excitement was a really foreign concept for me. I grew up knowing Brandon as a place that you went to school and then you left and you found a job somewhere else, or you moved on in the world, and Brandon was a good incubator, but it wasn't necessarily an end destination or a place that would draw people, you know, tourists or business people. It was a very small city, and it was punching below its weight. They say that newspapers are the first draft of history, and this is sort of an interesting example, being able to go back to that first draft and maybe write a second draft. And that was an unusual experience for me, but I definitely feel like I was able to bridge some gaps between 100 years ago or 75 years ago and now, and I tried to treat it with the respect that I think it deserved. Luckily, I think it's a lesson that as a city we appear to have learned, is that if you delay making a decision for long enough, that decision is made for you. And the biggest problems that came out of the Prince Edward Hotel were the decay that happened once the heat was turned off and frost got into the concrete, and just like a pothole in a road, the support pillars started to crumble, they lost their strength. I personally think it could have been saved even at the last day, but I'm not an engineer. I wasn't there, and I think the argument couldn't have even been made if they had just kept the heat on for a small amount of money and a small amount of security, say. They really could have saved something that took a lot of time and a lot of effort to build back in the day.
One of the reasons, another one of the reasons that I sort of remained passionate about the hotel is because I was married from there. And our wedding reception was there. And we saw so much of Brandon's civilization coming through the door, and of Canadian travel.
Well, I had an unceremonious exploded appendix when I was 22, so that was the end of my career at the Prince Eddy, I'm afraid. But my, by then, husband was still working in the bar, and we had been married while I was still at the coffee shop. And I remember minimum wage was 99 cents. And I remember how excited we were when it went to $1. And I certainly remember, as we were both university students working there part-time, and I certainly remember keeping our tips in big mugs under our bed, and at the end of the month counting it out and hoping it got to $75 so we could pay our rent. Our life really revolved either through our studies at the university or our work at the Prince Eddy. So Brandon to us was either one of those two places. If we weren't at one, we were at the other. It was so grand, you know, with the huge ceilings and the candelabra and all the wood, and it was a wonderful place. I, with a lot of other people, rued the day when it came down. My husband and I were both in the crowd across the street on Princess watching, and very sad that it was happening. because it was a grand old hotel, and certainly a part of Brandon's history. It was the centerpiece of Brandon. Everything happened at the Prince Eddy. And so it was very sad, and we shed many tears with a lot of other people as we watched it being, I guess the word is, imploded.
We went to Winnipeg to the Royal Alexandra, the Fort Garry Hotel. That was the quality that was provided there. And people traveled that distance, whether it be by train or whether it be by road, and were exposed to it. And so they expected it in their town, their city. There was probably a resentment by a percentage of the population that you have that exhibit of wealth and success, but down underneath that resentment was a real pride. There was a pride by Brandon people that couldn't afford to go to the balls or wouldn't be invited to the weddings, but they were proud of the fact that those were events that took place here. It was part and parcel of the culture and the society and the social strata and the social structure of our community.
Despite odds being stacked against him, Griffin and a local group would plan a pitch to save the structure from demolition. Unfortunately, it was already too late.
Myself and 5 other gentlemen had put together a plan to take over the hotel, and we were going to present the plan. We had approval to present the plan to the city. The council meeting that we were to present it to, the first article on the agenda was to demolish the Prince Edward Hotel. The second one was to hear our presentation. We never got heard because the demolition was approved. The people out of Winnipeg who won the contract for something like $186,000 or under $200,000 to destroy it, couldn't destroy it, so they brought in a explosive specialist from Texas, and he laced the east wing, the west wing, and the adjoining unit. And it took them 2 minutes to demolish it, which had taken 2 years to build. It had cost $400,000 to build it, and it cost them close to $200,000 to demolish it. I spent so much time and was very very fond of so much that went on in the hotel. And I guess it left a bit of a bitter pill when we weren't able to present our case. If it was still around today, it would be the catalyst that would retain a downtown life in Brandon, because it would be of a different age, an extreme degree of sophistication, which there is an appeal to people of this age. Not all, but many, and certainly enough to support it. And it would be the picture place of Brandon, it really would. I think my fondest memory is of our elevator operator. His name was Dermot Golding. He had been there since, not since the Prince Edward opened, but not long after. It opened in 12, and I think he joined them in about 28. He was a little man who had never married, was absolutely loyal, and never missed a day of work. He knew everybody that came in to the hotel because he had been there for so long. He was always impeccably dressed. He was always extremely respectful. And I will never forget when I first arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning off the CPR and was met by Steve Weir, who was the general manager at that time of the 3 hotels that remained. And when I was taken to the hotel, and he knew who I was and why I was there, and he shook me warmly by the hand and said, "Welcome to the Prince Edward, Mr. Griffin." Yeah. He was he was an individual who you don't forget. Well, that would be the individual that was most memorable, and then I suppose the next most memorable thing was my wedding reception, which was in the main dining room of the Prince Edward Hotel. And the chef was absolutely outdid himself with the most magnificent smorgasbord, everything we could wish for. And that bowl I had filled with 24 red roses and was centered in the buffet. We had everything, absolutely everything. It was lovely.